my loves, and welcome back to the Horus Heresy, episode 3, I believe we're on now, and indeed on book 4. This is an interesting point in the series, because this is where it branches out. This is where you've got everything established. The situation in the universe is pretty much established now. You've got Horus's rebellion. It has been declared. The Imperium is in a state of absolute shock and attempting to respond to it. This is where the series fractures, basically, and you have multiple different story arcs depending on which legion and which area of the universe you want to explore. So it's very easy to skip around at this point. After the first 3 establishing books, you could go and read Fulgrim or Mechanicum or any of those, and it would be okay. The next book, chronologically, in terms of publication, is The Last Flight of the Eisenstein, which switches focus quite dramatically, actually, from the Sons of Horus to the Death Guard. So this is the first time that's happened in this series, and it's really interesting, because, of course, now you have this very different energy occurring. You have this very different ethos. The Death Guard are notably different from the Sons of Horus in terms of the way they act and operate. Psychologically, they're very different. They're very taciturn. They're very morbid. They have this reservation about them and this stolidity, which is handed down from their Primarch. I mean, Mortarion in this book is really interesting because he's presented not as the protagonist. He's presented through the eyes of his sons, through the eyes of, in particular, the protagonist, Nathaniel Garrow, who, of course, worships the ground he walks on, which is just the nature of the nature of the dynamic between the Primarchs and their sons. That's the way they are. Mortarion is this very distant, very fascinating and mysterious character. Whenever you see him, he is this tall, gaunt, robed figure whose face is always hidden behind a mask, through which he's breathing like all of these chemicals and toxins. That's what he breathes all the time, to sort of test his endurance. He doesn't breathe clean air, ever, Mortarion. It's a way of demonstrating to himself what he can endure and of enhancing his durability, but also it's a kind of self-abnegation. He's actually harming himself. It's almost like a psychological or neurotic thing going on with him, and you never really see a great deal not in the same way you do with Horus in the previous books. You get a lot from Horus's perspective in the previous books, and that's fascinating. You don't get a great deal from Mortarion's perspective in this book. You really don't. That's actually preserved for later on, for The Buried Dagger, which is one of the very last ever published in the series, by the way. What you get is this image of Mortarion as this distant, almost saintly figure. He's very quiet. He hardly ever talks, Mortarion, and when he does, it's in this sibilant kind of whisper. He's very economical in terms of his movements, in terms of his speech. When you actually see him fighting, when you actually see him waging war, it's with an economy of motion that you would associate with, say, a samurai or some warrior to that effect. He wastes not an ounce of energy or motion. It's almost as though he doesn't move. It's like a blur, and suddenly his enemies just fall to bits. He's a fascinating character, very mysterious, very strange. You also get, in the same way that you got like a rogues gallery of Sons of Horus introduced in the previous books, you get a rogues gallery of Death Guard. So you've got Nathaniel Garrow, you've got Ignatius Grulgor, who some of you will know, deeply unpleasant character. Whoa, Ignatius is a vile character. You get Calas Typhon, of course, who will later become Typhus. Again, Typhon is, he's the equivalent of Abaddon in this book, very close to the Primarch, the one who has the Primarch's ear. But also, Typhon he's more like Erebus in the sense that he knows what's going on. He's been planning this for centuries. Actually, it may be that he's been planning this even before the Death Guard got off of Barbarus, because he is actually the bastard son of a human female and one of the alien overlords of Barbarus. He should never have been a space marine, I can tell you. He's got some real issues as Typhon. But he's manipulating both Mortarion and the entire Death Guard towards their ultimate destiny. He's the one that's guiding them. He's the one that knows what's happening. And he's actually in council with Erebus. Him and Erebus are kind of... They're cut from the same cloth. They're of the same accord. And they know what they're doing. They have every comprehension of what they're doing and what is going to happen, and that's fascinating too. Garrow is the loyalist, basically. There are quite a few, actually. Even Ignatius Grilgor, as nasty and as he is actually he actually does defect along with Garrow at one point, but that doesn't last, as you'll see. It's quite fascinating. You get this, again, just like in Galaxy in Flames, you get this distance between what's happening generally within the Legion and what's really happening behind the scenes. There is this politics occurring, all based around these little warrior subcults that Erebus and the Wordbearers have established, which of course know that the Legion has actually defected from the Imperium and is about to declare for Horus's side, you know? Characters like Nathaniel Garrow don't know this. They actually aren't aware of it, and that is fascinating. Again, the Death Guard really worship their Primarch. They are in love with Mortarion. They regard him as the epitome of perfection. So the notion that he could betray them is insane. It's absolutely insane. They can't handle it. It takes Garrow a long time to get to grips with it. It's not really until he sees the fires of Istvan III from the decks of the Eisenstein and he realizes what's happening. And what he does, he actually retreats. He hasn't got any choice. He takes the Eisenstein for himself, and him and all of the Death Guard still aboard retreat from Istvan, and they attempt to cut through the warp to try and warn the rest of the Imperium of what's going on. It doesn't necessarily work, though. There is this problem that occurs. For one thing, Ignatius Grilgor and his lot, they kind of enact a mutiny. They want to take them back to Istvan and to present them as traitors so they can rejoin the Legion. And that results in something very interesting. For the first time in this series, you get to see some of the real effects of chaos. You start to see the real weirdness of chaos, which of course, this being the Death Guard, is the influence of Nurgle. What happens is Ignatius and his Death Guard are consumed by the Life Eater virus. It's unleashed in one of the decks of the Eisenstein, and it consumes them. But as it's consuming them, Nurgle starts to pay attention. He starts to see this rancid, flickering soul of Ignatius Grilgor at the heart of it, and he takes Grilgor and he recreates him. He recreates him as the Demon Prince that we know him to be these days. He's still around. Ignatius Grilgor has been in the background for a while now. He's still around. The Demon Prince of Nurgle model that you can currently buy, the big bloated one with the big swollen eye and the Cyclopean horn, that's Ignatius Grilgor. It's not named as that when you buy the model, it's just the Demon Prince of Nurgle. But that is Ignatius Grilgor. And he actually becomes a key part of the Death Guard's story. He recurs again and again and again and again throughout the Horus Heresy series, both as a foil to Nathaniel Garrow and as an advisor to Mortarion. Fascinating stuff, eh? Eventually, they do make it. A lot of the Death Guard themselves are wounded by Ignatius Grilgor's sons and by the monsters, the demons of Nurgle that break their way through. There's actually a particular Death Guard who's actually loyalist, who suffers a really nasty wound, which infects him, and it has horrendous results. It actually doesn't kill him. It infects him with some disease from the warp, and it transforms him. It transforms him into a creature called the Lord of Flies, which is a nice sort of occult and mythological reference to Belial, who's a demon who actually exists in occultism and mythology. He actually becomes a servant of Nurgle in the same way that Ignatius Grilgor does, and again recurs throughout the Horus Heresy series as a foil to Nathaniel Garrow. But what's really fascinating is when Nathaniel Garrow and the fleet arrive within Imperial space, they are apprehended by none other than Rogel Dawn. Rogel Dawn and the Imperial Fists, and this is where you start to see, because the focus has been on the traitor legions throughout this series, rather, and it's very rare that you've actually seen any of the loyalist Primarchs or the loyalist legions, and this starts a trend in the Horus Heresy series, which is that the loyalist Primarchs generally are not presented in a very flattering light at all. The traitor Primarchs, for the most part, are given lots of reason for doing what they do. When you read the books about Lorgar and about Perturabo and about Fulgrim and about Magnus and about Angron, it makes sense. You understand why they rebel. You understand what they're doing and what they're feeling, as monstrous as they become. There is rationale behind it. The loyalists, for the most part, they're presented really negatively. They're either bigots, or they're ignorant, or they're violent, or they're ill-considered. Rogel Dawn is actually one of the worst of them, alongside Leman Russ. And when Garrow tries to tell him what's happened, Rogel Dawn won't have it. Rogel Dawn almost kills him, actually. He just flies into this rage, calls him defective and whatnot. And it takes a lot before he actually will accept what Horus has done. He needs to have this real hard evidence, because he can't take it either. And okay, it's kind of understandable, because the notion that a Primarch would turn on a Primarch is at that point almost inconceivable. It's almost inconceivable. So and the notion that Horus, the most beloved, the most trusted, the one that they all get on with, every single one of them could turn, is ridiculous to them. It's like an anathema. It's something they can't even get their heads around. But Rogel Dawn is presented in such a negative light in this book, it's unbelievable. Garrow, just this normal Death Guard, is presented as superior to him. Vastly superior, cleverer, certainly, than this genetically cultivated, Ubermensch. Definitely. But he does eventually accept it. It takes a while, but he does come round. And this is where it really starts. You start to see the coalescence of certain concepts that will recur throughout this series. Garrow, in particular, and the survivors of the Eisenstein are broken apart, and they become the very beginnings of certain things that are now absolutely established in the background. So Nathaniel, as I mentioned in the previous one, is the proto-Grey Knight, as are a lot of his allies from the Eisenstein. They become the very first Grey Knights. Not yet. What they actually become, what the survivors from the traitor legions, the ones who defect from the traitor legions and remain loyal to the Imperium become, they actually excoriate themselves of all legacy. It's why they start to wear the grey armour. They all start to wear grey, colourless armour without any markings at all, because they've rejected their legacies, they've rejected their previous loyalties, and their purpose is to wage a kind of clandestine guerrilla war against the forces of Horus, and that's where this begins. It starts here with Garrow and the last flight of the Eisenstein. It's really interesting, really interesting. Some of the imagery is great, particularly pertaining to Nurgle and the way his demons work, and the way he reshapes the Death Guard into demons and demon princes and whatnot. Fascinating stuff. There's some very wild, sort of chaotic, abstruse imagery in this book, and you start to see the full depths of the corruption that will eventually claim the entire Death Guard. It starts here, and it's absolutely fascinating. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Book 4, Last Flight of the Eisenstein. When we come back, it's going to be Book 5, which is one of my absolute favourites in the entire series. So, ladies and gents, until then, bye-bye!